In the early 1800s, winter in the Rocky Mountains was not a season, it was a test. Men didn't talk about comfort, they talked about surviving until spring. At elevations above 7,000 feet, cold arrived early and stayed longer than anyone expected. Snow didn't just fall, it stacked, hardened, and refused to leave. Wind cut through valleys like a blade. Temperatures dropped far below zero and stayed there for weeks. Most frontier cabins were built the same way: thick logs, clay chinking, a stone fireplace in the center. The logic seemed sound. Heavy wood meant strength, tight walls meant warmth, fire meant life. But winter exposed the flaw. As temperatures dropped, logs shrank. Gaps opened. Cold air slipped in silently. Heat escaped faster than a man could replace it with firewood. Many cabins stayed barely warmer than the outside air. Men woke up with frozen water buckets beside burning hearths. Some never woke up at all. Firewood was limited. Cutting more meant time, calories, and risk. Every trip outside burned energy that couldn't be replaced easily. Frostbite didn't announce itself. It just took fingers, toes, or worse. Most settlers believed the answer was more effort, bigger fires, tighter walls, more wood. One man believed the opposite. Instead of fighting the cold head-on, he focused on slowing it down. While his neighbors packed their walls tighter, he rebuilt his cabin with a strange idea. He added space, empty space, a deliberate gap between walls. People laughed at it. They said cold would pour straight through. But he wasn't guessing. He was remembering. He had seen this before in the old world. In places where winter killed the careless and rewarded the patient. Where people learned that still air mattered more than thick wood. That mass mattered more than force. This wasn't superstition. It was observation passed down through survival. When the worst cold of the decade hit, most cabins lost heat the moment fires burned low. His did not. Inside his cabin, the temperature stayed nearly 30 degrees warmer than outside. No extra fuel, no extra fire. Just a different way of thinking. Winter didn't care about opinions, it cared about results. And the results were clear. The problem wasn't effort, it was design. Frontier settlers worked hard. No one can argue that. They cut trees by hand, hauled stone-split firewood until their shoulders gave out. But most cabins failed for the same reason. They were built to resist force, not manage energy. Cold doesn't need an opening you can see. It only needs a path. Log cabins relied on tight joints and clay chinking. In mild weather, that worked. In extreme cold, it didn't. Wood shrinks as temperatures drop. Clay cracks. Gaps appear where none existed before. Once air starts moving through a wall, heat follows it out. Wind made it worse. Sharp cabin corners caught wind and forced it against the walls. Pressure pushed cold air through every weakness. Inside, warm air rose, escaped through the roof, and pulled colder air in from below. The harder the wind blew, the faster heat was stripped away. Most men responded by burning more wood. That solution had limits. Firewood had to be cut, hauled, and split. Each trip outside cost calories. Each calorie mattered. A man burning extra fuel just to stay warm was already losing the long game. And fire alone doesn't solve heat loss. A fire creates heat, it doesn't keep it. This is where most cabins failed. They treated warmth as something to generate, not something to protect. The mountain man who rebuilt his walls understood a different rule. Heat loss matters more than heat production. If you slow heat loss, you need less fire. Less fire means less wood. Less wood means less labor and less risk. His cabin didn't rely on perfect seals, it relied on layers. The outer wall broke the wind. The inner wall held warmth. Between them was still air that couldn't circulate, couldn't carry heat away. Moving air steals heat, still air blocks it. This idea wasn't new. It showed up in earth lodges, sod houses, stone huts, and snow shelters across the world. But many American settlers ignored it because it looked inefficient. They thought empty space was wasted space. Winter proved them wrong. When temperatures dropped hard and stayed there, cabins with single walls lost heat fast. Cabins with layered walls slowed the loss enough to survive the night. Not because they were stronger, because they were smarter. Cold doesn't care how hard you work. It only responds to physics, and physics always wins. When the mountain man rebuilt his cabin walls, people noticed. Not because it looked impressive, but because it looked wrong. Frontier logic was simple. Tighter was better. Thicker logs, more clay, fewer gaps. His design did the opposite. He stacked 2 walls instead of 1 and left a clear gap between them. Not packed tight, not sealed solid, just enough space to trap air and keep it still. Neighbors said it was a mistake. They thought cold would rush into that space and freeze the cabin faster. They assumed more wood meant more warmth. They didn't understand that wood by itself is a poor insulator. It slows heat transfer, but not enough when temperatures fall far below zero. Air, when trapped, works better. The gap he left between walls wasn't random. It was deliberate, wide enough to prevent airflow, narrow enough to avoid collapse. In some sections, he filled it loosely with dry grass and pine needles. Not packed. Never packed. Compression would allow heat to move through faster. The goal was stillness. When fire warmed, the cabin heat reached the inner wall. From there, it had nowhere to go fast. The trapped air slowed the transfer. By the time cold reached the outer wall, most of the heat was already held inside. This single decision changed everything. At night, when fires burned low, most cabins cooled rapidly. Temperatures dropped hour by hour. Inside his cabin, the drop was slow, sometimes barely noticeable until morning. That difference mattered. A slower temperature drop meant fewer trips outside for wood, fewer calories burned, less exposure to wind, less risk of frostbite or injury in the dark. This wasn't comfort, it was survival math. One neighbor joked that he had built a wall for nothing. Another said animals would chew through it. Some said it would rot from moisture. None of that happened. The air gap stayed dry. Moisture moved outward instead of collecting inside. The cabin stayed quieter too. Wind noise dropped. The walls absorbed pressure instead of resisting it. By the first deep freeze, laughter stopped. Not because the cabin looked better, but because it worked. Winter didn't reward appearances. It rewarded designs that respected how heat moves. And this wall, simple, cheap, and mocked, did exactly that. Most people think insulation is about material. More wood, more stone, more thickness. That's a mistake. Insulation is about air that doesn't move. The mountain man didn't know modern terms like R value or thermal resistance, but he understood the result. When air is trapped and cannot circulate, it stops carrying heat away. Once air starts moving even slightly, it becomes a conveyor belt for warmth, and cold takes its place. That's why his wall worked. The space between the walls wasn't empty in a careless way. It was controlled. No straight channels, no vertical gaps where air could rise and fall. In some areas, he added loose organic material, only to break up air movement, not to fill the space. This prevented convection. In most cabins, warm air rose, escaped through the roof or cracks, and pulled cold air in behind it. This created constant circulation. Even with a strong fire, heat was always leaking out. His design slowed that cycle. The inner wall warmed first. The air gap absorbed that warmth and held it. The outer wall stayed cold, but cold stayed outside longer. Heat loss didn't stop, but it slowed enough to matter. That's the key difference. You don't need to stop heat loss completely. You only need to slow it enough to survive the night. This principle shows up in some of the most effective shelters ever built. Snow igloos, sod houses, earth lodges. Even animals understand it. Foxes dig dens with curved entrances and trapped air pockets. Birds fluff their feathers to trap still air around their bodies. Nature figured this out long before humans did. The mountain man simply applied it to a cabin. The benefit was immediate. Fires burned lower. Wood piles lasted longer. Interior temperatures dropped slowly instead of crashing. Most importantly, mornings became survivable. Waking up in extreme cold costs energy. If a man starts the day already freezing, he's already behind. In his cabin, mornings were cold but manageable. Water wasn't solid ice. Fingers worked. Tools could be handled without skin tearing. This bought him time. Time to cut wood safely. Time to hunt without desperation. Time to survive long enough for spring. Still air did what brute force never could. It turned winter from a constant emergency into a problem that could be managed. The wall didn't work alone. What made the cabin truly different was weight. Logs, clay, earth. All of it added up to mass and mass changes, how heat behaves. Heavy materials don't warm quickly, but they don't cool quickly either. Once they absorb heat, they hold it and release it slowly over time. This is thermal mass. The mountain man didn't use the term, but he built for it intentionally. His inner wall was thick. The floor was packed earth. In some sections, stone was set low along the base, where cold usually crept in first. During the day, the fire warmed the cabin. That heat didn't just warm the air. It soaked into the walls and floor. By evening, the structure itself had stored energy. At night, when the fire burned low or went out, most cabins cooled fast. Air lost heat first, then thin walls followed. Cold took over in hours. His cabin behaved differently. As the air cooled, the walls released stored warmth back into the space. Not fast, not dramatic, just enough to slow the drop. The temperature still fell, but it fell gradually. That mattered. A slow temperature drop prevents shock. It keeps moisture from freezing instantly. It keeps breath from turning into ice on walls. It keeps tools usable. It keeps a man functional instead of desperate. This also reduced condensation. In poorly designed cabins, warm air hit cold surfaces and turned to water or ice. That moisture made everything worse, clothing, bedding, even the structure itself. Thermal mass stabilized that problem. Surfaces stayed closer to the air temperature. Less condensation formed. Bedding stayed drier. Dry bedding meant warmer sleep. Warmer sleep meant fewer calories burned overnight. Again, this wasn't comfort, it was efficiency. Most settlers thought survival meant adding heat. This man focused on keeping the heat he already had. The result was simple math. Less firewood burned per night. Less time cutting wood. Less exposure to wind and frostbite. More energy left for hunting, repair, and staying alive. Winter is an endurance problem. Anyone can survive one cold night. Few can survive 3 months of it. Thermal mass turned his cabin into a buffer, a place where temperature changes happened slowly enough for a human body to adapt. That's the difference between surviving winter and being worn down by it. Most frontier cabins failed before the fire ever went out. They failed because of wind. Cold air on its own is dangerous. Cold air pushed by wind is deadly. Wind doesn't just lower temperature, it strips heat away faster than the human body can replace it. This is why 2 cabins at the same temperature can feel completely different depending on exposure. Traditional log cabins were square or rectangular. That created corners. Corners are weak points. Wind hits them, splits, and creates pressure differences. High pressure on the windward side forces air through cracks. Low pressure on the leeward side pulls warm air out. This creates suction. Once that starts, no amount of fire can keep up. The mountain man understood this without using numbers. He saw how snow drifted, how smoke moved, how wind curled around trees and rocks. He placed his cabin carefully. He turned the narrow side toward prevailing wind. He banked earth against the lower walls where cold settled hardest. Most importantly, his double wall system acted like a shock absorber. When wind hit the outer wall, it lost energy. By the time it reached the inner wall, it was already weakened. The trapped air space between them prevented pressure from transferring directly inside. In other cabins, wind pressure moved straight through the wall. This is why men woke up freezing, even with fires still burning. The fire wasn't failing, the structure was. Another problem was height. Many cabins had tall walls and steep roofs. Warm air rose and escaped. Cold air rushed in to replace it. This constant exchange drained heat all night. His cabin stayed lower and tighter vertically. Heat stayed where people lived. The walls didn't funnel warmth upward and out. Snow also worked differently on his cabin. Flat walls collected drifts unevenly. Snow piled up in ways that increased pressure and forced cold into gaps. His cabin allowed snow to bank naturally against the exterior, adding insulation instead of damage. Most settlers saw snow as an enemy to clear. He saw it as free protection. When storms hit hard, his cabin became quieter. Wind noise dropped. Interior air stayed calmer. Calm air stays warm longer. This wasn't luck. It was placement, shape, and respect for how wind behaves. Cold doesn't attack evenly. It probes. It searches for weak points. Most cabins gave it plenty. His did not. That's why when winter settled in and refused to leave his shelter, held while others slowly bled heat into the dark. Most men trusted fire to solve every problem. If a cabin was cold, they burned more wood. If that didn't work, they burned it faster. When temperatures dropped hard, some kept fires going all night, waking every hour to feed them. That approach had limits. Fire creates heat, but it does nothing to control where that heat goes. In a poorly designed cabin, most of it disappears almost as fast as it's made. Warm air rises, wind pulls it out, cold replaces it. The cycle never stops. This is why men ran out of wood before winter ended. Cutting firewood in deep cold is dangerous work. Muscles tear easier. Sweat freezes. Tools slip. One bad fall or numb fingers can end a season or a life. Burning more wood meant spending more time exposed to risk. The mountain man saw fire as a support, not a solution. His cabin was designed so fire only needed to raise the temperature slightly. Once the structure absorbed that warmth, it held onto it. He didn't need roaring flames. A steady, controlled fire was enough. This changed daily life. He didn't wake to a frozen room. He didn't rush to stoke embers before his fingers failed. He didn't burn through his woodpile by midwinter. The fire worked with the cabin instead of fighting it. Another advantage was air quality. Overheated cabins filled with smoke and carbon buildup. Men cracked doors or windows for fresh air, letting cold rush in. His cabin didn't require that trade-off. Fires burned lower. Drafts were controlled. Air stayed cleaner. Sleep improved too. Cold sleep drains the body. Shivering burns calories fast. Poor sleep weakens judgment. Weak judgment leads to mistakes. In winter, mistakes kill. His nights were cold but steady. No sudden drops. No shock. Just controlled discomfort. The kind a human body can endure for months. That consistency mattered more than warmth. The goal wasn't comfort, it was sustainability. Firewood lasted longer. Energy was conserved. The cabin became predictable instead of volatile. Most men treated winter like a battle they had to win every night. He treated it like a long campaign. Fire alone can't win that. Design can. That's why when spring finally came, some cabins were empty and his was not. Because the smartest survival tool he used wasn't an axe or a rifle. It was restraint. Cold alone doesn't destroy a cabin. Moisture does. Most settlers didn't think about it. They worried about temperature, wind, and firewood. But moisture quietly ruined more shelters than cold ever did. Wet air condenses on cold surfaces. Water turns to ice. Ice cracks wood. Wet bedding steals body heat. Damp clothing becomes dangerous. In winter, moisture is the enemy you don't see until it's too late. Inside a cabin, moisture comes from breathing, cooking, melting snow and wet boots. In a poorly designed shelter, that moisture has nowhere to go. It freezes on walls and ceilings. By morning, cabins are lined with frost. As fires burn, ice melts and drips back down. Bedding gets wet. Tools rust. Wood rots from the inside. The mountain man's cabin handled moisture differently. The layered wall mattered here just as much as it did for heat. The inner wall stayed warmer. That reduced condensation. Warm surfaces don't collect water as easily. Less ice formed inside the living space. The air gap between walls played a second role. Moisture that did pass through the inner wall moved slowly into the cavity. From there, it migrated outward instead of freezing inside. The outer wall took the damage, not the interior. This kept the living space dry. Dry air feels warmer than wet air even at the same temperature. Dry bedding insulates better. Dry clothing keeps heat in. Dry tools function. Most cabins failed this test. Men slept in damp blankets. Their clothes froze stiff overnight. Putting on frozen boots in the morning cost heat before the day even began. Over time, this constant moisture exposure weakened the body. Illness followed, fatigue followed, mistakes followed. His cabin avoided that spiral. He didn't need vents cut into walls. He didn't crack doors open in storms. Air exchange happened slowly and passively, just enough to manage moisture without dumping heat. Again, this wasn't comfort, it was control. Winter survival depends on managing losses. Heat loss, energy loss, moisture loss. You can't eliminate them. You can only slow them enough to stay ahead. Most settlers focused on fighting cold. He focused on managing systems. That's why his shelter aged better through winter. While others dealt with rot, ice damage, and sickness, his cabin stayed stable. Moisture is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. But the man who plans for it lasts longer than the one who doesn't. What separated this cabin from the others wasn't strength. It was balance. Most frontier shelters were built around one idea: keep cold out. That sounds reasonable, but it ignores how cold actually behaves. Cold doesn't need permission. It doesn't break down doors. It slips in through pressure movement and imbalance. This cabin didn't try to stop cold completely. It slowed it, redirected it, and managed it. Every part worked together. The double wall reduced heat loss. The trapped air stopped convection. The heavy materials stored warmth. The shape reduced wind pressure. The layout kept heat where people lived. The structure handled moisture without mechanical help. Remove one of those elements and the system weakens. Together they reinforced each other. This is why copying only one feature never worked for his neighbors. Some added thicker walls but ignored wind exposure. Others burned more wood without fixing heat loss. A few tried packing walls tighter and created moisture traps that made things worse. They treated symptoms, he treated the system. Winter survival isn't about a single trick. It's about understanding how small losses add up. A little heat lost every hour becomes deadly over weeks. A little moisture every night becomes sickness by midwinter. A little extra firewood burned each day empties a woodpile before February. His cabin reduced all of those losses just enough. That just enough mattered. He didn't need to be warm. He needed to not freeze. He didn't need comfort. He needed consistency. That's what winter demands. The frontier punished excess. Big fires wasted fuel. Tight seals trapped moisture. Tall ceilings wasted heat. Rigid thinking got men killed. This design was flexible. It adapted to conditions instead of resisting them. When storms hit, the cabin got quieter. When temperatures dropped, changes happened slowly. When fires burned low, the walls carried the load. This approach shows up again and again in survival history. The best shelters aren't impressive. They're boring. They behave the same day after day. That's not an accident. Stability keeps people alive longer than power. The mountain man never claimed to be clever. He never argued theory. He just built what he knew worked and ignored the noise. When spring came, that decision spoke louder than any opinion ever could. Because winter doesn't care what makes sense on paper. It only respects what still stands when the cold finally leaves. When winter finally loosened its grip, the difference was impossible to ignore. Some cabins were abandoned. Some were half collapsed from ice damage and rot. Others stood intact, but the men inside were thinner, slower, and worn down in ways that didn't heal quickly. Winter had taken its payment quietly. The mountain man's cabin stood unchanged. Not because it was stronger, because it had wasted less. That is the lesson most people missed. Frontier survival was never about winning against nature. It was about lasting longer than the season. The men who failed weren't weak or careless. They simply bled energy too fast, heat, calories, moisture, time. Each loss seemed small on its own. Together, they added up. This cabin reduced losses across the board. It didn't demand constant attention. It didn't require heroic effort every night. It allowed the man inside to wake up functional instead of depleted. That meant better decisions, safer work, and fewer mistakes. Mistakes are what kill people in winter. A slip with an axe, a wrong decision about when to go out, a misjudged storm. Fatigue creates all of them. The frontier rewarded systems that reduced fatigue. This is why the lesson didn't spread quickly. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment of triumph, no invention to sell, no new material to brag about. Just a quiet structure that worked better than expected. People prefer loud solutions. Bigger fires, more tools, more effort. But winter doesn't reward noise. It rewards efficiency. This cabin proved that traditional knowledge wasn't backward. It was refined by failure over generations. People who survived long winters didn't argue theory. They kept what worked and discarded what didn't. Modern building science would later explain all of this with numbers and equations. But the frontier didn't have time for that. It relied on results, and the result here was simple. One man stayed ahead of winter without burning himself out. Others did not. That difference didn't come from luck. It came from understanding how cold actually works. The real mistake wasn't laughing at the stupid wall. The mistake was forgetting that survival knowledge is earned, not invented. And once it's lost, winter is quick to remind you why it mattered. The mountain man never wrote his ideas down. There were no plans, no drawings, no manuals. He didn't explain himself in long conversations. He didn't try to convince anyone. He simply built what he knew worked and let winter judge it. That's how most real survival knowledge survives. It isn't taught in classrooms. It isn't discovered in comfort. It's carried by people who lived long enough to pass it on. What kept his cabin warm wasn't a secret trick. It was a mindset. He paid attention to loss instead of gain. He understood that survival isn't about adding more, it's about wasting less. Less heat lost, less moisture trapped, less energy burned, less risk taken. Those small savings compound over time, over weeks, over months. That's what gets a person through a long winter, not strength or stubbornness alone. Today we live surrounded by systems that promise control. Central heating, perfect insulation, endless fuel. Most of the time, they work. But when power fails, supply chains break, or conditions turn extreme, the old rules come back fast. Cold still behaves the same way. Wind still finds weak points. Moisture still steals heat. The frontier didn't disappear. It just changed form. The lesson from that stupid wall isn't about copying a cabin design. It's about thinking in systems, understanding how heat, air, and effort interact, respecting the limits of the human body and building around them instead of fighting them. The men who survived the frontier weren't the ones who worked the hardest every night. They were the ones who built lives that didn't demand constant rescue. That's the kind of wisdom that lasts. Because when winter comes, and it always does, nature doesn't care how modern you are. It only cares whether what you built still works when everything else stops.